Some nights change your life in a way that you can never go back. That night was exactly one of those nights for me. I'm 58 years old. I spent years working as a librarian, living my life in order, following certain rules. Then I retired and moved to a quiet coastal town. I learned how to live with solitude after losing Henry. I thought I'd spend the rest of my life in peace, but no matter how much you think you've left the past behind, some things show up at your door when you least expect them. Like Nathan returning. Henry's nephew Nathan had been absent from my life for almost 5 years. Back then, he was just a restless, impulsive young man full of wild ideas and untamed energy. But now, standing in front of me, he was a 30-year-old man. Life hadn't been kind to him. I could hear it in his voice when he called and asked, "Can I stay with you for a while?" I could tell he needed refuge. Of course, my door was open to him, but the moment I saw him at my doorstep, I realized that maybe I was the one who needed saving. Nathan had changed. His frame was stronger, his eyes darker, carrying shadows I hadn't seen before. The boyish charm had faded, replaced by something deeper, something heavier. But the real difference? I felt it the next night, in the kitchen. That was the night everything began. The air felt charged with an energy I couldn't explain. There was a restlessness inside me, a kind I hadn't felt in years. Maybe I just wasn't used to hearing another person breathing in my home after so long. Nathan had left early in the morning and hadn't returned all day. I could tell something was weighing on him, but I didn't ask. Some wounds aren't meant to be touched until they're ready to be revealed. It was close to midnight when I finally heard the front door open. Relief flooded me, but along with it, a strange tension settled in my chest. When Nathan walked in, the exhaustion on his face and the faint scent of whiskey were unmistakable. He was slightly drunk, but still in control. When our eyes met, I saw the burden he carried, the silent weight pressing down on him. "You okay?" I asked, closing the door behind him. He nodded, exhaling deeply as he leaned against the wall. "It's been a long night," he said, his voice low and weary. Looking at him, I felt a sudden wave of tenderness. This young man was carrying too much. For a moment I hesitated, then turned toward the kitchen. "I'll make you some tea," I offered. "Might help clear your head." As I moved toward the stove, I could sense his gaze following me. Even with my back turned, I knew he was watching me. "This place is warmer than I expected," he said suddenly. I glanced at him over my shoulder. "You mean the town?" "Warmer than anywhere I've been," he answered. But his eyes weren't scanning the kitchen. They were on me. For a second, my heart pounded so hard I thought it might escape my chest. He was watching me. It had been years since I had felt someone's gaze on my skin like that. The quiet intensity in his eyes made my breath hitch. The silence in the kitchen stretched between us as the tea steeped, saying more than words ever could. Nathan leaned against the counter, one hand in his pocket, the other running through his hair. He looked tired, maybe even broken. I knew he was still watching me, but I busied myself with the cups, placing them on the counter, avoiding his gaze. And yet, despite everything, I could feel the air between us shifting, thickening, as if something unspoken was waiting to be acknowledged. As if this night was about to become one of those moments that change everything. There was an unease inside me, something unfamiliar, yet at the same time, a warmth I couldn't quite explain. "You know," Nathan said after a moment, his voice soft, thoughtful, "sometimes, no matter where you go, you can't escape feeling lonely." I met his gaze as I handed him his cup. In his eyes, I saw a vulnerability I hadn't seen in a long time. "Loneliness is a strange thing," I murmured, my voice carrying a quiet sadness. "You get so used to it that when someone finally shows up, you don't know how to handle it." Nathan lifted the cup to his lips, taking a slow sip. "And you?" he asked, his eyes steady on me. "Did you get used to it?" I inhaled deeply, feeling the weight of his question settle over me. "I don't know if I'd call it getting used to it," I admitted. "But over time I learned to accept it. Life doesn't go back to what it was. That doesn't mean you stop thinking about what's missing." Nathan nodded but didn't look away. "Sometimes people think they've gotten used to being alone," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But really, they're just trying not to feel anything." Something about his words struck a chord deep inside me. Maybe he was right. Maybe I hadn't truly adapted to being alone. I had just been avoiding feeling anything at all. A moment of silence stretched between us, the only sound coming from the ticking clock in the kitchen. Nathan traced the rim of his coffee cup with his fingers, his eyes watching me intently. There was warmth in his gaze, but also restraint, as if he were holding himself back from crossing an invisible line. "You know, I've never seen you like this before," he said suddenly, a small smile tugging at his lips. I raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" He shrugged, still not looking away. "Still this strong, and still this beautiful after all these years." A small ripple of something I couldn't name passed through me, but I forced myself to remain composed. Lowering my gaze to my coffee cup, I smiled slightly. "I guess time can't change everything," I said softly. Something shifted between us in that moment. Something I couldn't quite define. Maybe it was a sense of closeness, or maybe it was the return of something long buried. But I wasn't sure if I wanted to acknowledge it. Noticing how late it had gotten, I stood up, hoping to shake off the emotions stirring inside me. "I should get to bed," I said, offering a small smile. "It's been a long day." Nathan nodded, but his eyes lingered on me. "Yeah, you're right." As I placed my cup in the sink and left the kitchen, I could feel his gaze following me. It left something behind, a thought, a feeling, an emptiness I couldn't quite name. As I walked toward my bedroom, I felt a storm brewing inside me. That conversation had stirred something deep, something I had long ignored. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I felt it again, that strange, nameless feeling. Nathan had changed. Not just in appearance, but in the way he carried himself, in the way he spoke. And that change forced me to confront something I had been running from for years. I didn't know what it was, but I could feel that something had already begun. After that night, things started to shift. It wasn't something we talked about, but it became more evident with each passing day. The distance between us had noticeably shrunk. I don't even know how to explain it, but when I watched him sip his coffee in the kitchen, or when our eyes met over breakfast, it was becoming impossible to ignore the way my stomach fluttered. I wasn't the same as before. It was as if something inside me was waking up and I wasn't fighting it anymore. I found myself moving more freely around the house, no longer as guarded as I had been. In the mornings, I didn't tie my robe as tightly as I used to, like I did when I lived alone. But I wasn't sure if Nathan had noticed, or if I even wanted him to. In the mornings, I didn't bother tying my robe as tightly as I used to, like I did when I lived alone. But I wasn't alone anymore. Nathan was here, and even though I was fully aware of that, there wasn't a part of me that felt uncomfortable about it. I could tell Nathan was becoming more aware of me too. He wasn't acting the same way he had when he first arrived. Within a few weeks, he had moved beyond just adjusting to being here. He acted as if he belonged, like he wasn't just passing through, but as if he had settled in for good. Most nights, instead of going out, he stayed with me. We'd have dinner together, talk for hours, and somewhere along the way, we started having movie nights. Sprawled out on the couch, watching films, time seemed to slip away. Nathan would make comments, sometimes laughing out loud, and I'd catch myself watching him instead of the screen. There was a warmth inside me I hadn't felt in years. I never thought I could feel this comfortable around someone again, but that night was different. The closeness that had been growing between us for weeks felt even stronger in the air. We were watching a movie, the room dimly lit, the flickering glow of the street lamp outside casting shifting shadows through the half-open curtains. Nathan's hand rested on the couch beside mine, his fingers barely brushing against mine. As the movie played, I became aware of a slow building tension between us. The space between our hands grew smaller and smaller, as if neither of us was consciously making a move, but somehow we were closing the gap anyway. At some point I felt his gaze shift from the screen to me. Slowly I turned my head and our eyes met. This time there was nothing hesitant about the way he looked at me. He wasn't trying to hide anything. His eyes locked onto mine. Deep, unreadable, filled with something unspoken. His breaths were slow, measured. My heart pounded so hard I was sure he could hear it, but I didn't look away. It was as if every word we could have said had disappeared, leaving only this moment between us. Nathan tilted his head slightly, his lips parting just a little. In that moment, I had no idea what I was supposed to do, but I knew one thing: this was just the beginning, and there was no going back. Nathan didn't hesitate. He leaned in, his face so close that I could feel the warmth of his breath against my skin. At first, his lips barely brushed against mine, as if giving me a chance to pull away. But I didn't. I couldn't. That fire inside me, the one I had ignored for so long, wouldn't let me. 1 second, maybe 2. The kiss started slow, then deepened, turning into something more intense, more desperate. The way he pulled me against him, the way his hands wrapped around my waist, awakened feelings I had buried for years. My hands moved instinctively to his shoulders, my fingers tangling in his hair. Nathan's touch, it was so firm, so certain. I could feel just how deep the emotions he had been holding back truly were. But right at that moment, reality crashed over me like a thick fog. This was wrong. A sudden wave of panic rose inside me. I pulled back quickly, my breath still tangled with his. His eyes were full of questions, but I couldn't answer any of them. "My hands are shaking," I whispered, more to myself than to him, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I stood up, my heart hammering in my chest. I need to get some water," I said, grabbing onto the first excuse I could find. I turned toward the kitchen, avoiding his gaze. I wasn't even sure if my feet were touching the floor or if I was floating. My pulse pounded in my ears. I grabbed a glass, my fingers trembling slightly. "What the hell is happening?" I murmured to myself. "How did this even happen?" As my thoughts spiraled, a sharp crashing sound jolted me back to reality. The unmistakable noise of shattered glass scattered across the floor. Every muscle in my body tensed. "Nathan?" I called out. No answer. I rushed back into the living room and froze. The glass coffee table in front of the couch was completely shattered, and Nathan's hand bleeding. I didn't even have to ask what had happened. Out of frustration, anger, or maybe something deeper he couldn't contain anymore, he had thrown his glass down, breaking the table into pieces. Seeing the blood on his hand sent a strange mix of fear and guilt through me. Slowly, I sat down beside him, but he wouldn't look at me. His eyes were locked on the floor, his breath uneven, his fists still clenched, his jaw tight. I reached out, placing my hand lightly on his arm. The moment I touched him, he flinched. Then, finally, he turned to look at me, and in his eyes there wasn't just anger, there was hurt. "Do you really not want me?" he asked, his voice low but filled with emotion. I couldn't look away. "What?" I whispered. But he wasn't done. "For days I haven't felt alone. For the first time in a long time, Olivia," he said. "And then you pulled away, like it meant nothing, like it was just a moment that didn't matter." I shook my head, something inside me breaking, because I knew exactly what he was thinking. I knew how fragile Nathan really was. I knew how much he feared being abandoned, and now I had made him live through his worst fear. Gently, I took his hand, carefully opening his palm, examining the bleeding cuts. "This wasn't just a moment," I said. My voice wasn't supposed to shake, but it did. "Nothing about this was fake, Nathan. Everything was real. Too real." His eyes narrowed, searching my face, wanting to believe me, but afraid. I could feel it. The hesitation, the doubt, the unspoken questions that hung heavy in the air. "Do you really not love me, Olivia? Do you really not want me?" I held my breath, silencing every thought screaming inside me. Slowly, I stood up. I ran my hands over my shoulders, letting the straps of my dress slide down. His eyes followed the movement, darkening, pupils dilated. His breathing turned uneven. Now he had no words left. "Do you believe me now, Nathan?" I whispered, my voice sparking the heat between us even more. Was it all a lie? His gaze roamed over me, and he swallowed hard, but still he couldn't say a single word. Instead, he grabbed me by the waist and pulled me against him, rough, urgent. Then his lips crashed onto mine like a starving man. This time, I wasn't the one running. This time, I was the one surrendering, completely. With Nathan's strong arms locked around my waist, I knew there was no going back. A man who kissed like this, hungry, desperate, claiming, wasn't here for just a passing moment. When I looked into his eyes, I saw everything he had been holding back: his emotions, his desire, even his frustration. I hadn't felt this alive in years. Nathan's breath was uneven, his fingers trailing slowly down my back. Then suddenly he reached for the buttons of his shirt, undoing them one by one without taking his eyes off me, as if he were memorizing me, trying to etch this moment into his mind to prove it was real. When he finally shrugged off his shirt, tossing it next to my dress, my gaze instinctively traveled over his body. This wasn't the same Nathan I once knew, with broad shoulders, a firm chest, and sharp, defined lines. He was nothing less than a man. He leaned back against the couch, his arms loosening for just a second, giving me space, watching me. And me? I wasn't hesitating anymore. I slowly placed my knees on the couch, moving over him. My hands rested against his bare chest, and the second I felt the heat of his skin under my fingertips, a spark ignited inside me. Just like that, I leaned in closer and pressed my lips to his again. This time, our kiss was deeper, hungrier, and far more dangerous. I felt something huge inside me, bigger than anything I had ever felt before. Everything was happening so fast, but I didn't care. Every now and then, I found myself whispering his name. I was completely lost in him. I was excited, and with the rush of that excitement and desire, it didn't take long for everything to reach its peak. My fingers gripped the couch, then slowly moved to his chest. My whole body trembled as a sound escaped from my lips. My nails left a few marks on his skin. Nathan looked at me, smiling. "These shouldn't just be memories. You have to keep them fresh." It didn't take long before the tension in him melted away, and with the heat of the moment, he completely let himself go, breathless, giving in to everything. We were both calmer now. We lay next to each other, neither of us speaking until our breathing evened out. That night, as we lay there side by side, a heavy weight settled inside me. What the hell were we doing? I took a deep breath, staring up at the ceiling. "What happens now, Nathan? This feels wrong," I whispered. Nathan turned his head toward me, his eyes more serious than I had ever seen them before. "This isn't wrong, Olivia. This is real. We can't act like we were some kind of mistake. We're going to leave. Somewhere no one knows us, somewhere no one can judge us. I want a happy life with you." His words hit me hard. Was he serious? For even a second I had thought maybe this was just a passing thing, a moment of weakness. But now his words carried a much deeper meaning. I turned to him in shock, my eyes searching his. "Did you think this was just some one-time thing?" Nathan didn't look away. "Olivia, I've wanted this for years." My heart nearly stopped. "What do you mean?" "You mean before?" Nathan let out a small, almost sad smile. 5-6 years ago, even when Henry was alive, even when we lived in the same house. I wasn't ready to hear that. My heart pounded like crazy. "Nathan," I whispered, but I had no idea what to say. He sat up slightly, leaning closer. Back then, it felt like some stupid, impossible thing, like I was just a kid. But I'm not a kid anymore, Olivia. I know what I feel. Somewhere deep inside me, hearing those words sent a strange sense of satisfaction through me. But at the same time, fear. Could I really go through with this? Stay tuned because this story isn't over. If you've made it this far, I know this story has pulled you in. There's so much more to share. You don't want to miss it. Hit that follow button, turn on notifications, and drop a comment below. The silence in the dimly lit hotel bathroom wrapped around Olivia like an echo of her solitude. The warm water cascaded over her, attempting to ease the tension in her skin, but a growing unrest churned deep within her heart. Something was about to change. She could feel it creeping closer, both thrilling and terrifying. As she lathered soap over her legs, the emotional storm inside her intensified. Her thoughts tangled, clashing without clear direction. She was alone tonight, tucked away in this quiet suite while her husband Daniel attended a corporate retreat. The usual comfort of solitude felt different this time. An unshakable sensation settled over her, a presence she couldn't explain. Even though Adrian shouldn't have been here, she felt him close. That realization sent a shiver through her. Something was wrong. The bathroom door creaked open slowly. Olivia's breath hitched and she froze. Her mind raced, urging her to remain calm, but every muscle in her body tensed involuntarily. The sound of Adrian's footsteps echoed against the tiled floor. He stood behind her, silent, his presence shifting the very air around her. The water rushing between her legs did nothing to conceal what she was feeling. This was real. This was happening. Olivia, Adrian murmured, his voice unsteady, yet filled with conviction. I need to talk to you. Her heart pounded. The weight of the moment pressed down on her as her hands trembled beneath the stream. She felt his gaze on her back, yet she couldn't bring herself to turn around. Her body ached for his nearness, but her mind fought for clarity. Nothing made sense anymore. The pull between them was undeniable, an invisible force drawing them together. He took a step closer, then another. The space between them shrank until she could feel the heat radiating from his skin. Her thoughts blurred into nothingness. A silent scream echoed in her mind, but no sound escaped her lips. As she finally turned to face him, their eyes met, and suddenly there was no going back. The distance, the restraint, the years of unspoken emotions collapsed in an instant. Everything blurred together, past and present, longing and longing. Olivia saw the truth reflected in Adrian's eyes. He understood. He knew. I don't have to ask how you're feeling, do I? He whispered. Her lips parted, but words failed her. The turmoil inside her roared like a storm on the verge of breaking. It had all come dangerously close to the edge, and she knew there was no return. Olivia was 39 years old. She had built a life on certainty, on the stability of her marriage with Daniel, a man who had buried himself in work, leaving her alone with an ever-growing emptiness. Their home, once filled with warmth, had grown cold with silence. And then there was Adrian, young, vibrant, full of life, carrying an energy that awakened something in her. When he first entered her life, she hadn't seen him as anything more than a friend of the family, a familiar face at gatherings, a fleeting presence. But slowly his glances lingered longer, his words carried more weight, and his very existence filled the void she hadn't even realized was consuming her. Now, standing before her, he was no longer just a possibility, he was a reality, a choice. The air crackled between them,